Good evening. Welcome to Going Deeper. Great to have you with us. I'm Martin, and I'm currently in Hawley, in my office in the church building.
I'm Becky. I am not in Hawley. I'm in Finchampstead, which is where I'm based, in my home, with my strategically placed pot plant.
Oh, yes, I have strategically placed various objects, and I've managed to hide all of the rubbish behind the seats.
Yeah.
So we're all good to go. Welcome to you guys. Do say hi in the comment section. Hi to Richard. Hi to Neil. Hi to Meg. Hi to Leslie. It's great to have you with us. And if you're watching this after the fact, then thank you very much for watching it. And do feel free to write in the comments as well. Although obviously we can't answer any of your questions. But if you do have any questions, do feel free to pop them in the comments.
Yes, we'd love to hear.
Yeah, though I have to admit, it is quite tricky having a chat and reading your comments and answering them at the same time. But we will see how we get on. And yeah, bit of an interesting one tonight. Becky, what are we talking about tonight?
Well, we've been doing this series, which hopefully just from the title has gripped everybody, because we called it the Sex Talk for Grown-ups. And we've been talking about, well, kind of more than actually I expected to talk about from this series, because it wasn't just the standard sort of sex and relationships talk that perhaps we were expecting, but what does it mean to be church as we approach this area from different experiences? What does it mean to include people who are not in relationships? I loved week 2 where we talked about what does it mean to be a church where people who are single can be in family and things like that. And talking about sexuality, there's big questions in the church at the moment about sexuality, and talked about that last week. And then today talked about what does it mean to be holy. So probably more than people bargained for from this series.
Yeah. And obviously a big thank you to Karen and Heather and Chris, who were willing to be interviewed as well. So that they were great interviews and just gave us a bit of an insight, particularly in terms of Heather and Karen, into that kind of behind the scenes stuff, how people feel and people's life stories.
Yes.
Whereas Chris was more theology, wasn't he? He's a professor, and he gave us a real insight into sex and sexuality in the 1st century BC.
Yes.
So that was good.
Yeah, definitely. If people haven't watched any of those, I'd really encourage people to go back on YouTube and watch them. And by no means, tonight is not a full stop on the conversation either, is it? It's like now that we've opened this conversation up, there's so much that we've kind of hoped to introduce over the last month that actually most people will want to continue to explore, continue to talk about, continue to read up on, sort of thing. So yeah.
And I think something that's been really key in this whole month is I think, Becky, you touched on this last week when you talked about you were having a debate at school, and you can get very defensive, you can get a bit heated, you can get about standing your ground and making theological points. But actually, by doing that, we can forget it's about real people with real difficulties and struggles.
Yes.
And I think this series has been about people more than the theology of sex and sexuality, although obviously we've touched on that.
Yeah, definitely. And I've actually really, for myself, it's been great to, I guess, being like that, say, for example, at 6th form, I kind of learned to just not engage in the conversations at all, or just like it's best to just not talk about more complex areas. And I've really appreciated, and I think it's been the same for other people. I hope it has. Like, let us know in the chat if this has been a similar experience for you. But even just airing the conversation and getting it out onto the table and introducing it as an okay topic of conversation, even though it's difficult, I really appreciate that, because I think culturally as well, difficult conversations are like no-go zones nowadays, because it's just they're too kind of flammable. But yeah, it's been great to actually talk about stuff.
Yeah. And yeah, in the chat, do say if you have been chatting about this. I know a number of the home groups have taken this opportunity just to reflect on the sermon. So if you have been talking about this beyond the Sunday morning, then yeah, do say so in the chat, because that'd be really great. If you have. We had a number of questions come in through our email address, which is, I've got a special banner for this. Here we go. Got questions, hawleybaptist.org.uk. And a few people wrote some questions this morning as well. But Becky, I've got a question for you just before we kind of delve into this. I just wonder, how have you found this series? You prepared one of the talks, talk number 3, and has it changed your mind about anything?
It's definitely changed my approach. Like the talk, as I was writing the talk for week 3, being completely honest, I probably wrote that talk for myself, as in I needed to hear the challenge that I was trying to offer out to other people. And it's really, really reminded me, I was really struck. I got quite emotional after I spoke last week, just about the grace of God, which, we talk about all the time. It's the whole point of the whole deal. But when you actually really sit and think about it, and how much the grace of God has been evident in your own life, and how, it's just crazy to think that anybody's any more deserving of that than anybody else. That's the whole point. And that's been, I really feel like my heart was actually kind of changed through writing that. And yeah. What about you?
For me, I don't think I changed my views on anything particularly. What I think it did was help me to work those through. And I've had the opportunity to think carefully and to read around the subject and to just work it out. What is it that I believe and feel? Because I think so often our thoughts and our ideas are a little bit wishy-washy. We have a general feel, which is influenced by what people have told us, just our general feelings, and that's fine. But sometimes, particularly with more difficult subjects, you need to be able to sit down and work that through and go, actually, where am I getting that from? And is it right? Because then you're better able to talk about it, I think. So for me, that's been really helpful.
Yeah. I think being vague, I think sometimes we think being vague is more tactful, but actually it's not particularly helpful for people. And it just feels like trying to dance around subjects, doesn't it? Rather than kind of like.
And I think from my point of view, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's what's happened as a church as well. It hasn't changed the church's stance. What it's done is given a bit of a foundation to the stance that the church has taken for whatever reason. And I'm really pleased with the stance the church has taken with terms in regards to particularly homosexual sexual relationships. I'm really happy with that, and I'm happy with the diversity within our congregation in the views as well. I think hopefully it's challenged people, hopefully it's made them think, and hopefully it's just given a bit of a foundation to why they think the way they do. So Becky, some questions. Okay, do you want to start first? Because we've got one particular question that actually it came through during a service. So there's different ways that people ask us questions. This one came during a service. So what have you got?
So it's kind of come through in 3 parts. But if I could summarize the question, are we saying who the questions are from?
No, we won't say, because I haven't got who they're from here.
No. So you'll know if it's you, and you're welcome to say it in the chat. But basically the question boiling down to, why does it need to be marriage? Isn't a loving long-term commitment an equivalent? Isn't it a marriage? Like, could we not call it the same thing? And surely in that context, a sexual relationship is fine and equivalent to a marriage of another kind.
It's a good question. It's a good question. And I suppose there's a couple of approaches to that. I think in the first sermon I gave, I talked about safe sex, and we often identify that as just making sure we don't get any diseases or we don't get someone pregnant. But actually, safe sex in the talk reflected the fact that sex is incredibly it's intimate. It creates intimacy. It affects us mentally. It affects our self-esteem. It affects us in all sorts of ways, and therefore I feel we want to be able to have the safest context possible for sex. So we definitely not. I'm not condoning. And the Bible definitely doesn't condone one night stands. Hookup culture, stuff like that. Now you could argue, well, I'm in a long-term relationship. That's fine. But I would argue actually you want to make that as safe as possible. And the safest place for sex is marriage, a fully committed 100% marriage. Now, what you could say is, well, marriages fail. Or about 40% of marriages end in divorce. Not all marriages are happy. Not all marriages are safe. And that's a really tricky one. But I want to try and make it as safe as I possibly can. So I think for me, the context is a sacrificial Christian marriage between a man and a wife to keep it as safe as possible. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, I guess. It's not a particularly great answer.
Well, no, I think that's I think God wants us to experience sex in a context where we have a guarantee of permanence. God's relationship with us is a faithful one. It's one where he's always assuring us, I will always be there. I will always be with you. I will always be your God. And sex is introduced as something that should exist within that promise, that covenant. That's why we talk about the language of covenant in marriage and in God. Those are the two places where we talk about it. That there's this permanence and this guarantee of faithfulness and unconditionality. Is that word? I don't know. Yeah. That God wants us to experience. God wants that to be the conditions under which we give our body away to another person. I also think, I wonder if we get confused between having a wedding and having a marriage as well. I think lots of people get married to have a wedding. My husband used to work in a wedding band. The stories he would tell me of a groom getting drunk late at night, and he would just come over and spill his guts to the wedding band and say, oh, I'm only getting married because my wife said she wanted a party. She gave me an ultimatum or whatever. And of course, those marriages probably don't turn out that great. And so maybe we look at that and we go, oh, well, marriage doesn't work. But actually, maybe it's that getting married to have a wedding probably doesn't work. And you don't have to have a big wedding. You can have a tiny wedding. I had a tiny wedding. It wasn't my first choice, but I did end up having it. And now I'm a big advocate for it. And actually,
I thought you were going to say it wasn't your first wedding. It wasn't your first choice.
No, definitely my first legitimate wedding. There were a few at preschool, but actually, and I think maybe our view of what happens after a wedding has coloured what we think about marriage, whereas actually marriage, that promise and that covenant, and when that works, and why wouldn't you want that? When marriages work, why wouldn't you want that?
That's a really, really important thing, isn't it? It's not that we've got that. We talked about this in talk 2 about the idol of marriage.
Yeah.
That actually we could be signing up for an idol. We're worshipping the concept rather than what you're talking about, that covenant relationship, that sacrificial relationship, where when I had that conversation with Chris Tilling, we talked about wanting the best in the other person. To be intimate with someone that just wants your best, that's the safest place for sex. And for Christian, that's a Christian marriage. But like you said, some people don't go into marriage realizing that, and therefore it's not necessarily a safe place. And that's where it's down to us as a church to teach people. Sorry. I made a mistake, didn't I, Becky? Where I emailed out the link to the service, this link, I accidentally emailed out the link to become part of the live stream. We just had our first and only person so far pop up wanting to be part of the live stream.
Yeah.
So a huge apologies to them. Don't worry, no one saw you, but I spotted you and kicked you out. But that is completely my fault. But anyway, going back to the conversation, it's us, our job as a church to disciple people of what marriage is and be realistic. And if it becomes an idol, then we rush into something that we're not fully prepared for. It doesn't mean we can't marry the person, but sometimes we need to know what it is we're letting ourselves in for. And Paul said, look, you don't have to get married. even if you're engaged to the person, you don't have to get married. You need to be serious over what it is that you are, letting yourself in for. Yeah.
Yeah. Be great to hear any responses to that on the chat as well. Yes.
So I'm just, right. That was a question from you. What about, I'm going to give a question for you. Okay. So, and this is actually off the back of this morning's sermon. This person says, I've been saying that if and until God begins to make someone uneasy about their lifestyle, my role is to love them unconditionally. Did you say this morning that one part of holiness is to point out to others where their choice conflicts with God's standards? So I guess that's the idea of, if someone is doing something we feel is wrong, sinful, then actually we are called to say something about it. What's your response to that, Becky?
Well, I think firstly, I'd encourage, if you haven't watched last series, we did a week on conflict and a week on confrontation, where we talked a bit about how do you enter into talk about conflict that you have with somebody within the church, and then two, how do you be somebody who calls out everything that somebody's created to be in somebody, which involves sometimes saying the thing that person doesn't want to hear. But certainly when we were talking about that, what was very important in that context is that you're in relationship with somebody, you are in a relationship of trust, there's a mutuality to it, they speak into your life, you speak into theirs, they've actually asked you to hold them to account or to be in relationship with them, to walk alongside them. I think the problem comes when we walk up to somebody we barely have a relationship with and say, hey, look, I've got some pointers for you on how you can better follow Jesus, which is probably not the wise thing to do, even if you're saying the right thing. I mean, it's obviously, when you were talking about your message, do you want to maybe clarify for that person what other sorts of examples that you're talking about when you talk about how we call each other to a holy life?
I think what you're saying is incredibly important, Becky, is that you need to ask yourself first, have you got the right to say something? Are you in that relationship? Are you in the right position? Is you saying something going to push them away or draw them in? And that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, if a gay couple came into a church, I won't say ours, a church, and people discover they're gay, and every other person decides it's their job to inform them that what they're doing is wrong, you can imagine how they might feel. But actually, if a few months down the line, or maybe a year or so, they've built a relationship with someone, or then that person might be able to in a better position. Maybe that person's confided in them about something, and they're in a better position to say something in love. I think that's in love. We feel we can say the most horrible things as long as we put in love at the end.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it doesn't work that way. And in love is not for your point of view. It's how they receive it.
Yeah.
And that's where you've got to be so careful and ask yourself, do I have a right to say something?
Yeah. I think the critical thing as well is that in order to journey with somebody, you also have to be committed to journeying with them beyond that conversation. So how will you have that conversation in a way that means even if they don't see things the same way that you do, or they can't do what you say they should do, or how will you continue to walk with them beyond that point? And how are you going to make it clear to them that you still want to be in relationship with them beyond that conversation? And I think sometimes we would be in danger of approaching that conversation in a kind of final, like, this is an ultimatum. You can stay in relationship with me and friendship with me if you go the way that I'm suggesting you go, and we'll part ways if it doesn't work that way. That it requires a huge amount of grace on the person who's receiving that comments part as well. And I think as we go into following Jesus, we do invite others to speak into our lives by becoming part of the church, by really committing to being part of that community. And I think the more we can open up our lives to one another and invite that, and actually it's on us to take the initiative and be people who invite others to speak into them and say, like, will you say things that are in my life that you think are getting in the way of me pursuing God with everything I've got?
I mean, I'm not sure whether this is Neil or Angie, but they said, and what about all the other non-sex related things we do wrong? Are we happy for people to point them all out to us? And that's the key thing. If you think it's our right to go and tell anyone and everyone when they're doing wrong, well, put yourself in their shoes and think, actually, do I want every other person I see on a Sunday to point out something that I'm doing wrong? Now, I would argue, like you said, that actually we need to put ourselves in a position where people are able to say that, but that's with a core group of people that we have given permission to do that. That might be in a prayer triplet or whatever, but we don't want all on the Sunday coming and feel they've got free reign to tell me all my bad points, because, you know, I haven't got many, but, you know, I'd be upset if people pointed out everything I've done wrong.
Yeah, I love that comment from Neil and Angie, and I guess what it makes me think of is if you've never been on the other side of that, you need to be very careful playing that role, because if you haven't felt what it feels like when somebody else points it out in you, and if you haven't been somebody who's invited that into your life, it's probably the best place that we could come at a conversation like that from is being somebody who someone has challenged on something else, another area of their life, that sort of thing.
Just pick up from our previous question. Daniel's just said, I think as long as you are committed to the person you love, you don't need to get married. Becky, what would your response be to Daniel there?
My response to that question, I guess, is what's the barrier to marriage? So forgive me if I'm incorrectly interpreting what's underneath that question, but what's the thing stopping somebody from getting married? Is there something that you're concerned about marriage itself? And why not?
Yeah. And Daniel, don't answer that in the comments. If you do want to talk to us about it, then you know where I am, and you can write to us afterwards. But I don't want to end up with you having a big conversation with us in the chat, because we just won't be able to answer the question. But do feel free to talk to us about that. Yes. Another question? Do we feel we can move on? Yeah. Okay. So here's one. It is right to love gay people. Yes, that is correct. But, okay, so here's a question. 1, would you marry a gay couple? And 2, if someone in the process of transitioning wanted to worship here and take communion, what would you do? What should we do? I don't know whether they're talking about transitioning from one sex to the other. I'm guessing that might be. But yeah, that's an interesting one. And this is picking up on maybe some of the comments that are appearing in the comment section. So we're there to love gay people. We know that. We've been talking about that. But well, Becky, you won't be able to marry a gay couple.
I can't marry anyone.
You can't marry anyone, no. But I can. And that's a really tricky one. Because I loved what Neil spoke about in our last sermon series about wanting the best for people. Are we for people? And I think that's a really good starting point. Are we for these people? And we can be really for a gay couple who we want the best for them. We want to be friends with them. We want to help them and I guess bless them with the way that we treat them as much. But for me, and I've spoken about this in some of the sermons, is theologically, I don't agree with same-sex marriage. Now, it's not a simple matter, but that's where I'm at the moment. I recognize that my view may change, but at the moment where I'm at is I don't think that is biblically what I don't think that's biblically possible in terms of marriage. Therefore, I can't endorse it by marrying a gay couple. So that's just where I'm at the moment. Doesn't mean I can't love them. Doesn't mean I can't be part of our church and our fellowship. Why I can't hang out with them if they'd have me. All that sort of stuff. I just, in terms of a biblical marriage, which I'm a minister, I'm going to give you a biblical marriage. If you want a different sort of marriage, go to the registry office where there's no religion or faith involved at all. If it's a biblical marriage you want, you come to me, and I don't think I can give that to them.
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. There's the other off the back of that is that question is, would you bless a gay marriage? And because, people have come to me before saying, I'd like my marriage blessed, please. And that's a bit more difficult. So when we bless, we as a follower of Jesus stand in the position of Jesus and ask the best for a couple. So I would be confident I could bless a gay couple, but it's up to God what he does with that blessing. I'm just putting it on them. You're asking that God gives them the best for their lives, and God can surprise us. God can do all sorts of different things with that blessing. But I can say, I want what's best for these people. I'm happy to bless them and allow God to decide what that looks like. Whether I would do that in a formal way, that's a little bit different, politically a little bit difficult, because it's getting very similar to a marriage then, although not legal at all. So it's a really difficult subject. It's a really good question. I think in terms of the second, do you want to add anything to that before I go to the second part?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to that one.
No, it's a bit.
Talk about. Well, I suppose I'm glad I'm not in the position where I have to make those difficult decisions. And I think, it's I love that I've spoken to people at Hawley who have come along to people's weddings, even when they've said, do you know what, I find it, my reading of the Bible tells me that the definition of marriage that God has put into creation is between one man and one woman. But they've gone to the weddings of two people of the same gender and celebrated them and loved them.
Yeah.
And I hope I would do the same. But I don't think this is the thing, the church, the state, nobody stands in the position of God when it comes to deciding what's been put into creation. And something like marriage, we believe, pre-exists human inventions, and we can't change it. That's hard.
Oh, I'll just quick one from Daniel. He says, I'd happily get married, I just can't afford it right now. Daniel, I will do it for free. I will even buy you a meal afterwards. Just talk to you about it. But going back to the conversation we've had before, is actually it's our job as a church to make sure we explain fully what marriage is and what that commitment is, because I'm not sure everyone knows. And someone who aren't legally married can be more committed than people that are. So Daniel, I'll do it for free of charge. It's yours if you want. Well, depends on what you want. If you want like full marching band and stuff, then I'm afraid that we can't provide that.
Get married just prior to the next brass fusion evening.
Oh yeah. My brass fusion along.
On the second one, let's talk about the second one then.
So the second part was, if someone is in the process of transitioning and wanted to worship here and take communion, what would you do? What should we do? I think that's a fairly clear answer in terms of me. Becky, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think it's a different subject, and I do believe the subject's quite different. I think the subject of sexuality and the subject of gender transition are two very, I think, we need to get better maybe at having the conversation more appropriately geared towards those two different topics. But I think the same that I was talking about with in week 3, where I was talking about the fact that that invitation of coming and discovering life with God, handing your life over to God. Nobody has got a qualification or is in a better position to receive that than anybody else. And it's an ongoing discipleship process as somebody hands their life more and more over to God, and God renews them, transforms their mind, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, 100%, those people should be welcome with open arms.
Oh yeah. No, I totally agree. We can get ourselves all caught up in tie ourselves in knots with this one, and it's just accept people as we are. When I do communion, I say you come as you are. You come wanting to, if you're weak, you come wanting to be stronger. You come knowing that we're weak and we're all equal, and we all come knowing we all fall short, and we come by the grace of God, not because I give permission to a person to come. It's Jesus's feast, not mine. And that's a conversation you take up with him. It's not my place to stop someone.
And if there's anywhere I would want to take somebody who has questions about their identity, it's to Jesus, and not to fix their question or fix that problem, but so that they would find their identity as a child of God. Like, there's just no one I would imagine more wanting to help them see how much God loves them than somebody who has been through a difficult journey with their identity.
Linked to that, there was a question that came in last minute, literally just before we went on live.
A really good question, actually, and something that I guess we haven't been able to talk about as much as maybe we would have liked to, and that's how you introduce these topics to children, and how this affects how we journey through the ages and life stages with people. So I think this question was prompted by the fact that you shared a bit this morning about, Martin, you shared this morning about your understanding of what it meant to be an obedient, kind of law-abiding Christian in your teenage years, and the consequences that had for your faith at that stage in your life, and what it meant for you to understand the grace of God at work in your life. Really, is that a correct paraphrase?
Yeah.
So then this question has come in about how do we introduce children to the moral standard of following Jesus, of being a Christian, in such a way that it doesn't put them in this situation where they feel the standard is so high, there's so much they've got to live up to, that actually it becomes something that they can't feel that they can be part of, or they feel that they're sort of condemned by, or can't continue on that journey. And does that actually push back against a child's natural curiosity and the need that they might have to kind of struggle against, push against their faith as well, and sort of wrestle it down to the ground themselves?
No, that's a really good question. I think that we saw that in Karen's story. If you haven't seen that, do go on our YouTube channel, that interview with Karen, and how she was part of a church in her village. She hadn't come out as gay, but she knew that she was gay. And from the teaching she received at church, she was like, well, I can't change who I am, but it's obviously that I'm not accepted here, so I'm going to have to leave. And we don't want to create an environment where young people who are maybe struggling with sex, sexuality, identity, whatever, suddenly think, I can't do this. I'm not accepted by God. I'm not accepted by the church, and therefore I can't be part of this anymore. And I think this picks up. I talked about this morning sermon when the Jesus talks about woe to the Pharisees, and it talks about them shutting the door of the kingdom of God in their faces. So how do we talk about the fact that we are called to be holy? We are called to live a holy life, a distinctive, different, moralistic life, without actually shutting that door of the kingdom of heaven in their faces. And I don't know what the answer to that one is. That's a really difficult one, apart from trying to create an environment where people can doubt and people can struggle and people don't feel they have to have the right answer all the time. And that a lot of that is through in-depth relationships. How are we creating in-depth relationships with our young people? And I don't mean just with parents, because sometimes parents aren't always the best person to talk about these things, particularly, I guess, as the children get older.
Yeah.
They possibly want to talk to someone else.
Yeah. I think I was very struck by that question. So I was thinking, it came in about 5 minutes before. So I was quickly thinking about what this was like for me, what made the difference for me in my teenage years, wanting to still go in God's direction, even when I was being taught things that certainly went against the grain of what it means to be a teenager. So like I remember in my young teenage years having lots of heated conversations with my parents about what they felt, how they felt I should live in relation to alcohol, and how I thought it might be more fun to live. And then having conversations with my youth worker about boundaries around sex and intimacy. And I was trying to think, I guess it kind of struck me as I was reflecting on that it's as much about what you see as about what you hear from your parents and what you hear from your elders in the church. And I think the thing that made the huge difference for me, particularly in watching my mum and in watching my youth worker, was that I could see their reliance on God, their passion for God. Like they really believed in, they didn't just have a code of conduct. They really, really loved and believed in God. They experienced joy in following God. And I actually saw their joy. And also that they were honest about the reality of their own struggles in their faith. And I think if people see that, if children and young people see that, as well as hearing about what it means to live a life as God wants us to live, that to me feels like the best context you can put that teaching in. Because even when I didn't like what my mum or my youth worker was saying, I still wanted to be like them. And that has been what's made the difference for me.
And that for me as a church leader, but it shows as a church, we need to be so careful how we choose our, say, children and youth workers, but also how we disciple them and how we enable them and how we train them. If we just go, oh my goodness, we haven't got enough people to work with the youth. Oh, well, so-and-so's young and trendy, we'll stick them in. They could be the worst person because we haven't actually thought about their lifestyle or what they are and aren't doing. Whereas someone who's older could actually be absolutely perfect because there's someone they can trust. There's someone who's living a life that you want to emulate. And they don't have to be trendy. They just need to be open and real, I think. And how we as a church train them and disciple them, I think, is really, really important.
One thing I would just add quickly, and I realize time runs away.
Don't worry about that.
When I was a teenager, I probably didn't articulate it this way, but on reflection, I realized I thought there were 3 things about being a Christian: love God, love your neighbor, and don't have sex until you get married. And I believe that those were the 3 criteria. And if I'm completely honest, it kind of didn't matter what I was doing about loving God or loving my neighbor, as long as I wasn't having sex before I got married. I was doing it right. And I think we need to help people to understand that your sexual practices and the biblical teaching about sex comes under this great vision for humanity, which is what it looks like when somebody gives their life over to God and devotes their life to loving God and others. And that what you do with your body is an important part of that, but it's not the marker of what it means to be a Christian teenager. God is very concerned about your heart, and he's very concerned about how you love others. He's concerned about your stress with your exams and the fact that you give that over to him rather than carrying it on yourself. He's concerned about the fact that you don't gossip. He's concerned about lots of things. He's not just concerned about whether or not you're having sex with your boyfriend or girlfriend, And
I think we can be incredibly guilty of putting, like you said, doesn't matter what I think about God and Jesus, as long as I don't have sex before marriage, then I'm fine. And I think, therefore, when someone does make a mistake, we can be incredibly hard with them, particularly around sexuality. I did a bit of research where I did an internet search for prison Christian fellowship, so organizations working with prisoners and ex-offenders. And there was pages on Google of, in the UK, organizations working with people that have broken the law, and now there are churches and Christians working with them. I did the same search for people who have had an abortion, women who have had an abortion. How many Christian organizations are working to support those young women who have done something that we as Christians, depending on the context, but we're pro-life, aren't we? Generally, not everyone. Is there any organizations that support them? And I found one. And I think it shows a real difference between, we are quite happy to work with an ex-murderer, but actually there aren't many Christian organizations set up for people that who commit sexual sins, as we would identify them. And I think that's a real shortfall, and that's a real difficulty for young people who are struggling with sex and sexuality, and have maybe done something that the Bible says is wrong, or they are feeling things that they feel are wrong, and we can reject them. Or they can look at the church as a whole and go, if the church found out about that, I would be rejected. I would be out.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we really need to think carefully about. Is are we going to journey with people and love them regardless of the mistakes?
Absolutely.
They make?
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. And and we can reject them, or we can also just focus on that. So it's like, okay, now my job is to stop you from sleeping with so-and-so. Whereas actually there's probably, like, it might be about trusting God. It might be about they might be having other doubts in their faith that mean that it's hard for them to see that the will of God in that situation is good. And actually we want to help. I love Jen's put it way better than I can put it.
Well, what she put?
That your whole body, mind and spirit are joined, so you cannot compartmentalize. And I love that, because I think sometimes that's when we get into legalism, isn't it? When we're behaving correctly, or believing we should behave correctly, and beating ourselves up when we're not behaving correctly, but our mind and our spirit are not in the direction of God. They're still on ourselves, and that's where shame and guilt and we get into a lot of problems.
Yeah. I'm aware of time. I've got one last question, and I don't think we're going to go into this massively deep, but this is the question. It says, how do we, in practical terms, apply our theological understanding of sexual immorality alongside the loving response that Jesus demonstrated so clearly? Is there a red line that cannot be crossed, or can it never be that easy? So I guess that's the question around, we may think this is right and wrong, depending on our interpretation of the Bible, but Jesus calls us to love people. How do we get that balance between the two?
What do you think of what is there a red line?
That's a red line. I've pastored people who have been caught by the police for looking at child pornography online, and I've loved them, I've cared for them, I've journeyed with them, but there are, in terms of that red line, there are legal things we have to do.
Yes.
There are things we have to put in place. So there is a red line legally, in that your behavior has led to us having to take some sort of action. I think once we go beyond more lifestyle choices that are not legal problems, I think there is no red line. I don't think that we are called to forgive, and forgive a lot. And basically Jesus said, you just keep on forgiving.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that we just let them get away with anything. And that's more around that abuse stuff. The church has a history of going, oh, well, we won't take it any further because they said sorry and we're called to forgive. And then they just continue the abuse. And that can be any kind of abuse, not just sexual.
Yeah.
And I think we have a right to protect the least in our society and the least in our church, those who are vulnerable. And that's a duty of care. And that's a red line for me, in terms of actually, not in terms of loving the person, but in terms of having to manage their behavior.
Yeah. I think I like you use the word balance, like the balance of loving people, like it's the grace and truth thing. And I guess the reason that we get kind of tied up in it all is Jesus doesn't represent a balance of those two things. He represents all of them, both of them, fully, simultaneously. And it's not like a half a measure of this and half a measure of that, and it's not a compromise of the two. And I guess as human beings and not being Jesus, often we just end up only being able to quite manage like a weird mixture, or weighting way too heavily on either side. I discovered today, and I would really encourage everybody to go and do this exercise, to read the whole of Matthew 18. And Matthew 18 is where we get the teachings from Jesus on things like how you point out somebody else's sin. It also talks about the fact that sometimes other believers can cause us to stumble in our faith and what we should do when that happens. But sandwiched in between those teachings, so those are teachings about kind of church discipline and how do we keep order and how do we point out and correct, is the teaching on the 99 sheep and how God leaves the 99 to go after the one who's gone astray. So that comes before the passage on church discipline. Then you get church discipline, and then a passage that some people think means throw people out of the church if they're not behaving, but it doesn't. So go and look into it. Then underneath that, you get the teaching on how many times should I forgive? 7 times 70, aka keep forgiving, keep forgiving, keep forgiving. And that really blew my mind today. And I really would encourage people to go and do some study on that passage and see how like they're almost teachings that you think can't sit together, but they do. It's so interesting. Yeah.
And I ended the series this morning. If you're in the room, I asked that question, what would Jesus do? If you watched it online, I was talking about putting on the lenses of Jesus as we view our interpretation of the world, but the Old Testament, the New Testament, everything is all through the eyes of Jesus. And I think it's that, how can we embody Jesus, that grace and that truth? And for us, it's a bit of a tightrope walk, isn't it? And we have a tendency to go one way or the other. But as you said, Jesus embodied it all. And I think we can only do that by embodying Jesus and being filled with his Holy Spirit and listening and not, being judging ourselves, being concerned about our own pursuit of holiness, and allow that to affect us so that we can see clearly. We talked about that. You did the Bible study on 1 Corinthians 12. I did. You talked about it. I did the Bible study on it.
Yeah.
It enables us to see more clearly the more that we are transformed by the Holy Spirit, rather than the world.
And that reliance on Jesus. And I think so much of this comes back to us fooling ourselves, and I do it all the time, that I'm the one who's earning my place in God's affections, and the things I'm doing is the thing that, allows God to either tick a box next to me or go, no, she's not doing too good at the moment. And I love the passage I used in Philippians, which Paul says, like, he talks about like not relying on anything that he has going for him. He says, I don't rely on the right standing that comes by my ability to obey the law, but only by the right standing that comes by faith in Jesus, because of Jesus. And the more that we center ourselves back on that all the time, the better equipped we'll be at being able to deal with all of these things properly.
Yeah. That's brilliant. So we've ended with, what would Jesus do? I think that's
there's more profound, going deeper. Get it on a t-shirt.
It's now this has been our longest going deeper so far, but it's been really great to talk about these subjects, and thank you to all of you that have commented and got engaged with the conversation. That we love that when that happens. Once again, if you do have any questions, then just talk to us. You can
emailing
contact us through gotquestions@holyBaptist.org.uk or through Facebook, or just come and talk to us. Also, if you want prayer around this, because this subject may have raised some issues for you, maybe you've suffered some abuse or you are struggling in this area and you just want some talk, then we have a prayer team that can come and meet with you for a set number of sessions and just help you to pray around some of these things and just listen and care for you. So do contact us at prayer@hordybaptist.org.uk if that's something that you would find useful. And yeah, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, because there's loads of resources on there around this subject, and I'm sure that'll just continue to build as well over time. So this isn't going to be the last time that we talk about this subject.
No.
And also you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. So yeah, thank you guys. That's amazing. Just a reminder, we are starting a new series called Bystander, where we're looking at John's account of Jesus as we go into Lent and up to Easter. So I'm excited about that. And yeah, anything else, Becky, you want to add?
Oh no, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been part of this conversation, and thank you for being so gracious with people like Martin and myself who have to pretend like we know what we're talking about. It's really has been so helpful for me. I've learned so much through this, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Excellent. So thanks guys, take care, God bless, bye.
We'll see you soon. Bye.